All right, today we're jumping into a super interesting slice of history. It's about a surprisingly short period, just 38 years, from 1624 to 1662, but it's a time when a European trading company came in and basically laid the entire groundwork for modern Taiwan.
I know what you're thinking. How on earth are those two things connected? Well, the answer links the battlefields of feudal Japan to the forests of 17th century Taiwan. And believe me, it's right at the heart of this whole story. So stick with me, because you're going to want to hear this.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in the 17th century, and it's this mad dash for global dominance. All these European powers are scrambling to control the incredibly valuable trade routes in Asia. And smack dab in the middle of all the action is this one island.
And look, geography is everything here. I mean, just look at where Taiwan is. It was the perfect spot, a logistical dream. From there, you could sail north to Japan to get silver, head west to China for silk and porcelain, or go south to the Spice Islands. If you were a trading power, controlling this island wasn't just a nice to have. No, it was the absolute key to dominating the region's entire economy.
And the group that saw this potential crystal clear was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. Now, you got to understand, this was not just a company. Not even close. The VOC was basically a government unto itself. It had its own army, its own navy, it could sign treaties. It had the power to literally colonize places. And its number one goal? Complete and total control over Asian trade.
So after getting shut down trying to get a foothold on the Chinese coast, the VOC set its sights on Taiwan. And what began as just a simple little trading post was about to become the island's first ever central government.
The year is 1624. This is the moment. The Dutch land in the south of Taiwan, and they immediately start building their main fortress. This is the official start of Taiwan's dive into the world of global trade and politics. It's pretty much the beginning of the whole story we're telling today.
And their strategy? It was actually pretty genius. They didn't just build one fort. They set up two major strongholds in what is now Tainan. You had Fort Zeelandia, that was the political and military brain of the operation, and then you had Fort Provincia, which was all about the money. It was the commercial heart, built to manage the Han Chinese settlers and, most importantly, to collect taxes. This two-fort system was how they ran the show.
All right, so they've got their forts, they've set up shop, now it's time to make some money. That was the whole point, right? And they figured out really fast that this island, which they called Formosa, was basically sitting on a gold mine of natural resources. And this brings us back to that question from the beginning. The most valuable thing for the Dutch in Taiwan, especially at first, it wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it was deer skin. Yep, you heard that right. Thousands upon thousands of deer skins.
And this is where you can really see their global network just humming. The deerskins, they were shipped off to Japan, where they were a critical material for making samurai armor. The deer meat, that got sold to the huge markets right across the strait in China. And the horns, they were a super valuable ingredient in traditional medicine all over Southeast Asia. They monetized every single part of the deer and plugged it into a different market. Incredible!
But here's the thing. You can't hunt deer forever, right? The deer population started to dwindle. So the Dutch did what any smart business does. They pivoted. They moved on to a new commodity, one that would go on to define Taiwan's economy for centuries: sugar. They brought in new farming techniques and turned Taiwan into a massive sugar exporter for the entire world.
So you've got these three things really propping up the whole operation. The crazy profitable deer trade, the booming sugar exports, and then just a steady flow of cash from taxes on all the ships and merchants passing through. This wasn't just a colony, it was a profit-making machine. But making all that money, it came with enormous social change. I mean, the Dutch suddenly had to manage two very different groups of people. The indigenous peoples who'd been there for thousands of years, and all the new Han Chinese immigrants they were actively encouraging to move to the island. And their strategy for this, well, it was pretty clear-cut. They saw the Han immigrants as the workforce, the engine to farm the land, and of course pay taxes. The indigenous peoples, though, were treated as subjects to be ruled. The Dutch used this mix of force and what they called civilizing missions, setting up schools and churches to completely reshape their way of life. It was a policy that would change the island's demographics forever.
You know, one of the most incredible, long-lasting things to come out of this whole period was from the Dutch missionaries. They actually created a writing system for the local indigenous languages using the Roman alphabet, our alphabet.
These documents, called the Sinquang manuscripts, are the very first written records of Taiwan's native languages. A truly remarkable legacy when you think about it.
So, for a couple of decades, it really seemed like this whole colonial project was a huge success. But the Dutch grip on Taiwan, it was a lot more fragile than it looked. A perfect storm of internal rebellion and a massive external threat was about to bring the whole thing crashing down.
So let's break down how it all fell apart. First, in 1652, you had Han farmers who were just being crushed by heavy taxes rise up in this huge rebellion. Now, the Dutch put it down, but the cracks were definitely starting to show. And then, in 1661, came the knockout blow. A guy named Koxinga, a Ming Dynasty loyalist on the run from the new Qing Dynasty in China, shows up with this gigantic army and fleet. This was the threat that was going to seal their fate.
And it all came down to this one place, Fort Zeelandia. For 9 long months, the Dutch managed to hold out against Koxinga's massive army. But in the end, they were cut off. No supplies were coming, no reinforcements were on the way. They had no choice but to surrender. And just like that, in 1662, the 38-year Dutch era in Taiwan was over.
38 years. In the grand scheme of things, that's just a blink of an eye, right? But the changes the Dutch set in motion, oh, those were permanent. Their short time there left a footprint on Taiwan that you can still see plain as day.
Just think about everything they left behind. The Dutch were the ones who really plugged Taiwan into the World Trade Network. They brought in the first real ideas of a modern government, with organized taxes, land deeds, and administration. They're the ones who kicked off the mass Han immigration that defines the island's population today, and they laid the foundations for major cities like Tainan. It was short, but wow, was it a foundational era.
Which really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? Sure, the Dutch flag came down in 1662, but did their influence on the economy, on the people, on the very idea of what Taiwan could be, did that ever really go away? It just became the first layer that all of Taiwan's later history was built right on top of. Thanks for tuning in.